class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the San Jose Sharks goaltending situation, and more specifically, which of these two goaltenders should the Sharks look to trade over these next couple of weeks prior to this year's NHL trade deadline. But before we get to that question, there is another that logically does need to be posed before that, and that is whether or not the Sharks should even, in the first place, trade either of these goaltenders, or if they should carry both of them to the end of this season and into the future. Well, this question could be attacked from multiple different angles. One thing that is definitely true is that these days, in comparison to even just 10 or 20 years ago, it is much more important to have a solid tandem throughout the regular season. To put this into perspective, last year, the 22-23 season, the goaltender with the most games started in the entire league was Connor Hellebuyck of the Winnipeg Jets, starting 64 games. Besides him, only 6 other goaltenders actually managed to hit at least 60 games started on the season, meaning a grand total of 7 goalies. Going back exactly 20 years to the 2002-2003 season, the goalie with the most games started was Mark Denis of the Columbus Blue Jackets with 77 games started. He was, of course, a bit of an outlier, but taking it in a more general sense, 14 different goaltenders played at least or started at least 60 games that year. That is double the amount of goalies. So it just goes to show that over these years, it has been trending downwards, the teams being so reliant on their starter to play a ton of games, and how teams have now been going more so for a slightly more balanced goaltending tandem. Of course, there are still the teams that have a very, very good starter who is likely going to get a bunch of games, like with Winnipeg, or like with Nashville and UC Saros, Tampa with Andrei Vasilevsky, but you also have teams like the Boston Bruins, which ride a very solid tandem of Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman, and have been having a ton of success thanks to that. And so the San Jose Sharks could theoretically do something like that as well here with both Kaapo Kahkonen and Mackenzie Blackwood. So you could see certainly an argument for keeping both of these goaltenders. On the other side of things, it is still pretty dangerous for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that the San Jose Sharks aren't really looking to be competitive even just next year. Obviously, this year is a complete wash, but the 24-25 season isn't expected to be that much better, if at all, for San Jose, and they're almost certainly still going to be a basement-dwelling team that particular year. In fact, even the year after that, the Sharks are likely not to be all that great, and are likely more so eyeing the 26-27 season for when they might emerge out of their rebuild and start to try and build a semi-competitive team. So at that point, both Kahkonen and Blackwood, who are on the right side of 30 currently, will actually be exactly 30 years of age for that particular season. So that is a lot of time to hold on to two really solid goaltenders, just because you're hoping that 3 years down the line they can be lead your team to a certain competitive level. On top of that, neither of these two goaltenders are particularly consistent. While this year has been quite strong for both of them, last year, on the other hand, was really, really bad. Kahkonen was one of the worst goaltenders in the entire league last season, and Blackwood, mixed with his injury issues of where he was with the New Jersey Devils, was not particularly good even when he was healthy. And so while this year has been a turnaround, since goaltending as a position is so incredibly unpredictable, who's to say that either of these two goaltenders will not just go back to being bad next season? In fact, the Sharks have already had such a missed opportunities on their team very, very recently. Back in the 21-22 season, the San Jose Sharks had James Reimer on the team. He had 1 year remaining on his deal. It was a 2-year deal, and he was performing exceptionally well, or as well as a goaltender could do on a non-playoff team. And it was expected that the Sharks would look to move him at the trade deadline of that season. But that did not end up happening. And then it was expected that the Sharks would move him at the draft of that season, which again didn't end up happening. And as such, the Sharks brought Reimer into the 22-23 season as a goaltending tandem with Kaapo Kahkonen. And as I mentioned, Kahkonen was one of the worst goaltenders in the league. Reimer was only marginally better than him. And as such, Reimer became pretty much an untradeable asset for the San Jose Sharks. So you could see just how how quickly these more average or above average types of goaltenders can completely flip a switch and suddenly become quite bad. The Sharks don't necessarily want to miss the train on either of these two goaltenders who are currently at a much higher value than they were at last season, since this is a rebuilding team and you want to be able to get as many future assets as possible. So in my opinion, trading one of these two goaltenders at this year's trade deadline, or at the very least at this year's draft, is rather wise. Which does bring us to the question of which of these two goalies would look to get traded for the Sharks. Now, logically, for San Jose, they would want to trade the worst of the two as long as they could get the best value. But for other teams, they would want to pick up the best of the two. And so what we must deduce here is which of these two goaltenders are more attractive on the open market. Is it Kahkonen or is it Blackwood? Well, let's take a look at the stats first. Kahkonen has started less games this season by a decent margin than Blackwood at just 23 games started. Blackwood, on the other hand, has 31. Kahkonen only has 6 wins this season, though Blackwood's 9 wins is not that much better. For a team that is right near the bottom of the standings, this amount of wins compared to their game started is not all that surprising and shouldn't really be viewed all that poorly. In terms of stats, Kahkonen is at a 3.46 goals against average compared to Blackwood's 3.51, which is very, very close to each other. And in terms of save percentage, Kahkonen is at a .905 compared to Blackwood's .898. It should be noted that these days, the average save percentage in the league has actually fallen by a decent amount. Just 10 years ago, if your goaltender was at below 900 save percentage, you'd be disgusted with that they would be one of the worst goaltenders in the entire league. These days, with the save percentage hovering around like a .903 in terms of average, Blackwood is only slightly below that, and Kahkonen is actually slightly above that, and it should be noted still that save percentage is a very team-dependent stat, because when you're giving up a ton of great chances like the Sharks have been doing this season, you are bound to be giving up a lot of goals against. So neither of these two statistics are necessarily that much of a mark against either of these two goaltenders. The next stat I have here is actually goals for per game average, which is not directly related to the goaltender, as this is generally completely dependent on how the team in front of them is playing, but it does contextualize some of the stats that they have. So we see here that Kahkonen, the team in front of him, only gets about 1.87 goals for per game in the games that he starts this season, while for Blackwood it is at the very least above 2 goals per game at 2.03, which means for a team, when you are scoring more goals in the game, it is more likely that you are playing better, which means it's more likely that your goaltender stats will be better. So it's quite interesting, in fact, that Blackwood, who backstops a team that is scoring more goals, actually has worse stats than Kahkonen, who is backstopping a team that is having a ton of issues scoring those goals. And the final stat really does support that very argument, and this is goals saved above expected. Now, this is the only stat here that is somewhat that isn't really objective. It's much more of a subjective stat, which means there's going to be an inherent bias here, as it depends on the person who is viewing the chances of whether or not they expect it to actually go in or not. But it is still pretty useful, and we see here that Kahkonen has saved 7.7 goals above the expected amount of goals, which is actually quite good, just barely outside the top 10 of goaltenders who have played at least 25 games this season, which Kahkonen does hit because he's played more than 25. It's just he's only started 23 of them. Meanwhile, Blackwood is at just a 2.0, which is still decent, as it is above, it is in the positives and in lieu of the negatives, but clearly not as good as Kahkonen. However, if you were to take a look at last season, Kahkonen was down at almost minus 25 goals saved above expected, so it's been a huge turnaround season for Kahkonen. But just taking a look at all of these statistics, it seems pretty clear outside of the game start and the games won that Kahkonen has been doing better than Blackwood. But this isn't the only thing to take into account for whether or not a team would want to trade for either of these two goaltenders. The other would be the contract situation, which does differ between these two players. Kahkonen has just this final year on his deal, which means he will be in line for another contract this offseason. Compare that to Blackwood, who actually has one more deal after this one and will be in line for another contract at the end of the next season, which does give teams a certain amount of pause, both in the positive and negative sense. If a team is looking to pick up Kahkonen, it is very nice that he has only this final year on his deal, because it allows you to not have to plan super far into the future, because you know that if Kahkonen doesn't do particularly well for you, you could just let him walk in free agency. On the other hand, you could end up in a sort of Adin Hill, Vegas Golden Knights type of situation. What happened last season is that the Sharks traded Adin Hill in the offseason to the Vegas Golden Knights, and he ended up actually backstopping that team to a Stanley Cup, which was incredibly unexpected. But because Adin Hill had just the 1 year left on his deal, he was in line for a pretty significant raise on his next deal with the Vegas Golden Knights. If a similar thing were to happen to Kahkonen, not necessarily winning the Stanley Cup, but doing well enough with the team to actually deserve another contract, you would likely have to give him a raise at that point. Compared to Blackwood, because he is more cost controlled, yes, if he does poorly, you're kind of stuck with that deal for an extra year, but if he does well, now suddenly you're paying a goaltender who's doing quite well for yourself, maybe a couple of million at least below that market value. So it's a bit of a give and take, but I would imagine that most GMs would rather have the market flexibility that Kahkonen having no years left after this one on his contract, compared to the kind of potential upside that picking up a contract like Mackenzie Blackwood. So when you combine those two factors, where Kahkonen has the slightly more attractive deal, as well as the fact that his numbers are better, I would imagine a team would likely be looking to target Kahkonen as their goaltender of choice from the San Jose Sharks compared to Mackenzie Blackwood. From a San Jose perspective, obviously they would probably rather keep Kahkonen, not only because he's better, but the Sharks do also have put a bit more of an investment into Kahkonen. There were stories last season that they essentially had to break down Kahkonen's entire thoughts of the game and rebuild them entirely differently, just because of how badly he was playing last year, and that has clearly worked out for San Jose this season. And so you don't necessarily want to move on from a goaltender who you have invested a lot of time and energy into, but if the right deal does roll around and it is for Kahkonen instead of for Blackwood, I can't imagine Mike Grier would decline such a thing. And one final note to also be made here is that Blackwood also has a bit of an injury history over his short career thus far, which makes it an even more risky play for any other team to look into picking him up. So I would imagine if the Sharks will move on from a goaltender over these next couple of weeks prior to the trade deadline, that one would be Kaapo Kahkonen, and the Sharks would be left with Blackwood as their starter for the rest of the season and likely next year as well. Class dismissed.